Okay, thank you, Megan. Tonight we've invited Dr. Greg Brickner to talk, give us an overview on grazing practices for sheep and flocks, and maybe he'll touch on goats as well a little bit. I've known Greg, boy, I think probably close to 20 years now. Greg was a practicing veterinarian. He's currently a grazing specialist, works with Organic Valley, helping primarily dairy grazers with their dairy pastures. But he is a recovering dairy producer himself, and he now has a flock of sheep up in Woniwak, a little over an hour from where I am in southwest Wisconsin. And Greg's done an excellent job over the years in developing his grazing management. And this evening we're going to have him share some of the things that he's learned on how to do a better job managing our pastures and what we can really do with well-managed pastures and sheep production to keep our costs low and hopefully our profits high.
All right, well, thanks, Gene. That should, let's see here.
And let me see if I can share, give you to, let's see, assign that over to you. There we go.
Okay. There, I think I have control now then.
Looks good, Greg. You're ready to go.
All right. Well, Gene gave me a nice introduction. I appreciate that. Yep, I'm going to be approaching tonight's talk kind of about from a philosophy of feeding ruminants on a high forage or all forage ration, and how our pastures fit into that philosophy then. So yeah, keep in mind when I'm talking about this, my goals are, again, a high forage, all forage ration. And I'm going to emphasize perennial pastures. We'll talk some about the use of annuals and how they can fit in, and maybe a little bit about some grain. But again, we're going to emphasize perennial pastures with long-term management and growth. And we want to have a diversity of plant and animal species in these pastures beyond just the sheep and the grass too then. So we're looking for insects and birds and maybe some non-forage plants too, sharing those and still getting an excellent yield from our pastures. And you know, these are real keys as we move into wilder times to maintaining resilience then. So those will be my approach for this then. Just a quick thing, don't memorize this at all then. I just want to, we're going to be talking a lot about the quality of plants as they have different stages of maturity, and then how the animal in their rumen ferments these plants then. And so the part of it we're then. So that's everything that's not the protein or the minerals in these plants. And the way we break these down is some of those carbohydrates are sugars, starches, which are easily digestible, and pectin also, which is a glue that holds these cells together. Those are very digestible, readily used in the rumen and by the animal. And then at the far right, we've got the indigestible lignin part of it. That is what makes these plants strong. It's what makes trees woody, and it's indigestible. And then we've got this middle area of cellulose and hemicellulose, which make up, again, a big part of what makes these plants, gives them their structure. And these are the parts that ruminants have the special ability to digest using that rumen fermentation then. So we're going to talk about the various ratios of these components as the plants mature then. Just wanted to let you see how these break down and how digestible they are then. Okay, so it's going to all start in the animal's rumen. This would be if we're standing behind that sheep or goat looking towards their head. And that rumen is the big fermentation vat that lies on the left side of their body. And it's divided roughly into three components. And we've got a gas cap on the top. That's where the burps come from. And then we've got kind of longer fiber that floats on the top. And then a liquid layer below that black line. So the liquid layer is what, as things get digested in the smaller particles, they move on through the rest of the intestinal tract. But it's that top layer of the longer fibers, that's where the magic of the fermentation by those bacteria break down the digestible portions of that grass then. So we're going to be focused on what's going on, again, the interaction between the plant quality and what's going on in that rumen. And we look a lot at manure. You know, in cattle, they change even more drastically, but in sheep, animals grazing the kind of pastures that I'm going to be talking about, this is what their manure looks like. This is normal manure. It's not got the individual round pellets that we're used to when we're feeding dry hay. It should have a little bit of this, you know, cow pie appearance to it a little bit. And obviously, if we can get too loose with either an upset stomach or with parasitism, but this is the look we're going for. So what's going on in the grasses then? As these grasses grow, this is what's called a sigmoid grass growth curve, and we start out early in the spring. There's slower growth. On that blue line is the line that I'm going to be talking about here. We start off slowly until that grass has enough leaves to really capture enough sunlight to grow faster. And then that steep part of the curve, that's where our pastures are growing the fastest and where we want to ideally keep our pastures at, in that range, so that they'll be recovering fast and growing fast. And then as that blue line continues on, the plants become more mature, growth stops, and the plants kind of bottom out. So this is a commonly looked at chart. And, you know, on the left, we're comparing these plants by their height. And if you were to walk out into a pasture, you might see you might walk out into a pasture that's 6 inches tall, or one that might be 12 inches tall. And it just looks like there's just more grass in the 12-inch tall pasture, but there are really some significant changes that are happening within that plant. And if you look to the right there, that shorter grass has got 23 to 28% crude protein, which is far in excess of what these animals need then. And so they've got to deal with this excess protein, converting that, the bacteria convert that into ammonia, which the animal has to deal with and excrete, and that takes a lot of energy then. So that's excessive protein. The 40% NDF, neutral detergent fiber, that kind of represents all of that fibrous carbohydrate I was talking about and what floats in the top of that rumen. And it turns out that that 40% level is really not enough to create that nice fibrous level that we had the picture of earlier. And we're going to talk too about the neutral detergent fiber, D, that stands for digestibility. How easy is it for the bacteria in that rumen to extract energy from that fiber then? So that shorter grass, it has too much protein and not enough fiber. It has plenty of energy then. Now, if we let that grass grow a bit taller, we don't have seed heads. This is still green vegetative grass, but it's had a little bit more time to recover. What's going on inside that plant has changed dramatically then. Now we've got crude proteins down in the upper teens, which is closer to what that animal actually requires. The NDF, the neutral detergent fiber, is at 50%. Now we're going to create that nice fiber mat, and the bacteria are going to be able to extract much more energy out of the fiber that is there. And again, this is vegetative looking grass, so it's got a high digestibility too then. So we're not losing anything with potential energy, and we're actually extracting a little bit more energy out of that grass by just giving it a little bit more time to grow. I did see there was a raised hand. No?
If
Okay.
folk
Just keep going? Okay. All right. So again, by giving it a little bit more rest time, we're not just changing the amount of grass growing out there, but we've actually changed the quality of that grass. So this is kind of seeing this in pictorial form. The sheep on the right, those lambs grazing that ultra short pasture, there's not only are they having trouble just getting enough dry matter, but that's going to be very high in protein again, and it's going to be hard for that grass to set up that nice fiber mat. Whereas the lambs on the left, that's still vegetative grass, very digestible, very high quality, and it's going to be closer to what those lambs need and allow them to grow as well as to maintain finish as well then. So these two pastures, learn to look at these as being completely different feedstuffs then. So I want to go through the year looking at the quality of the grass and how it affects the animal and what they're getting from it, and then what we can do with troubling times of the grazing season. Obviously, there are times when it's a little more challenging. This is a really useful representation of grasses in our part of the world through the growing season. And the blue dots represent the protein level in those plants. The red squares are, again, that total amount of fiber. And then the green triangles are how digestible the fiber is that is in the plant then. So we're going to start in May, early turnout. This is where we're getting close to right now as the grass starts to grow, and how eager we are to turn them out onto grass will affect their performance then. If you look at again the levels of that early spring grass, we've got too much protein for those animals, not enough fiber. They can get plenty of energy from it, but it's not going to act in the rumen the way that we expect it to, and the animals are actually not going to get as much benefit from it as they can. So this is actually kind of a problematic feed for these ruminants early in the spring. And I have an example. This is not early spring grass, but it acts exactly the same way. So this, on my farm, a couple falls ago, I put in an annual mix of turnips, radishes, and oats. Incredibly lush. Again, probably excessive protein, not enough actual fiber. And I had put a group of weaned lambs on this. You can see there's a net fence going across that. And my lambs were used to being moved every day. Oops. The light went off in I'm not, feel like I'm playing a haunted house here, but okay. Anyway, this is incredibly lush. The lambs were used to being moved every day. They're moving them every day was no big deal to them. We got onto this grass, and suddenly they acted incredibly hungry then. They were agitated when it was time to move them. If you were to see them, they looked full, but they were not satisfied. And so what I did early, this would be the same thing we could do early in the spring, is I put out some good quality grass baleage on the ground. And that's the same paddock. And you can see that the animals are readily coming over and taking some bites of that baleage, and then also grazing the lush pasture as well then. And they're actually getting a lot more from that lush pasture by slowing down the rate of passage of those feeds through the rumen. And the rumen fermentation is making products that the animal can use to produce not just frame, but also finish as well then. So early in the spring, we don't want to just turn them out onto just straight grass, if at all possible. We want to ease that transition. And so a way we can do that is to bring some hay out to out to the pasture if we can't bring them back and forth. And it doesn't need to be very much. I think these lambs were getting around a half a pound a head a day offered, and they may not have been eating all of that, but again, that little bit of hay to slow down that rumen makes all the difference then. So that's one way to transition these lambs. And then the kind of hay that we're going to use, we're not going to use straw or rank first crop. First, it needs to be very palatable so the animals will actually eat it. And then when we're feeding a high forage ration, we really don't have room in that room, and they can only eat so much fiber. It has, all of the fiber we feed them has to be digestible then. So we're gonna look at a forage test. This would represent like the forage test I was using on those lambs there. And we're gonna, this is another way, a new way of thinking about forages, is really a source of energy rather than protein then. And so I have circled here all of the values that represent how much energy is coming from this forage then. I don't not care about crude protein, but protein is really not an issue on a high forage ration, but energy does become it then. So what I've circled here is, again, the total amount of neutral detergent fiber and then how digestible that fiber is. And for people that really want to pursue this and do a good job with it, it's going to require a forage test and then a slightly more expensive forage test to get that NDFD 30 number that's listed there. And what they do is take your forage sample and actually put it into rumen fluid for 30 hours. That's what that 30 represents. And they see how much of that forage was digested in those 30 hours. And that comes really close to estimating what it will do in the animal then. We want a minimum, if I'm going to supplement animals on pasture, I want a minimum of 55% for that NDFD 30. And then we've also got farther down that NFC kind of represents the amount of sugars and starches. And then also we've got at the very bottom the net energy numbers as well then of 35 for gain. And so we're going to focus on the having good quality and lots of energy from these supplemental forages. Okay. There's a lot more to be said about that forage quality, but for right now we're going to focus more on the pastures going through the year. Now we come to June, and our plants now are flowering, our grasses are flowering, and you can see that the quality of those grasses, both in protein and fiber and digestibility of that fiber, have greatly decreased. And we all know that flowering grasses, headed out grasses, have poorer quality. And this is, I just want to introduce the idea of how grasses grow with tillers. We've got our spreading grasses on the left that make new tillers by spreading with rhizomes or the new tillers come out away from the base of the plant then. Some examples of the species that do that. And then we've got our bunch grasses, like the orchard grasses and ryegrasses, where these new tillers arise from the base of the existing plant. And the reason this is important is, that these new tillers represent kind of the new stems growing from these plants. And we're going to use these tillers to kind of estimate what stage of maturity the grasses are at then. So this is tillers, and we can look at those out in the pasture. This would be a sample from June. The same pasture, 2 orchard grass plants on the same day. One on the left is flowering. Obviously, the one on the right is not, probably at a previous grazing event, that one on the right had the early seed tillers removed. And so I just want to focus in at the base of these plants. And the one on the left had the flowers on it. And you can see the heavy, thick tillers that support those flowers. But if you look at the base of the plant there, there's a lot more tillers coming up on the right-hand side. These are obviously, they look like better quality forage then. And what's going on is the flowers, as they're developing, they release a plant hormone that inhibits these new green tillers on the right from developing until after that seed is mature. And that could be as late for us as into August then, before these new grass tillers will arise. So this time of year, we want to try to remove that hormone influence from these plants and get them growing these new vegetative tillers and improve the quality. Now this is what it looks like out in the pasture. These are going to be two pictures of the same paddock again. This one, we've got those heavy flowering tillers at the in the foreground there. But if you look at the ground level, there's really no new tillers coming up. Whereas we get past that, now we've got these new green vegetative tillers coming through. And it, you know, we live in a northern climate with a limited growing season. And, you know, being able to gain these extra few weeks of this kind of growth can really make a difference in how well and how much our sheep gain during the summertime. So once we see our pasture starting to head out like this, we really want to take some sort of action to reset these plants and again remove that plant hormone influence. We can use density. If we crowd our animals tightly enough, we can trample those seed heads. And trampling, cutting will all result in the same response. Will remove that hormone influence. And you can see that the pasture was trampled on the left, and you can see the new vegetative tillers coming in on the right. We can obviously mow it, but there's a technique we can do where we can, if we know we're going to mow it anyway, we can actually clip it before we turn our sheep or goats into the field, and they will actually make a little bit more use. You'll kind of expose more of those green leaves that might lie below the seed heads and get a little bit more use from those pastures by clipping it ahead of time then. Okay, so now we've reset all these plants. There's no more seed heads out there. And for the rest of the growing season, we're gonna just get those vegetative tillers coming back. And the thing to really notice here now with the protein, the changes in the protein and the fiber levels, is that they stay fairly constant then. So this is the time of year when we can really start to lengthen out our rest periods, allow that growth, allow those changes to happen in that plant. And really this is when we build strong root systems, resilience in our pastures, and we can use this same factor to help control parasites in our small ruminants then. So again, recognizing that a little bit longer rest period is going to change the quality of that grass, we can start to manipulate that. So again, we're going to come back to this idea of the tiller or grass stem. And there's a technique where we can count the number of green leaves growing on a tiller, and it will tell us kind of again, that representation of what the protein and fiber levels are, and also what its energy reserves are. So if we were going to go out, we're going to use this leaf count on these tillers to help us decide whether these pastures are ready to be grazed or not. So we're going to go out into the pasture and sample 10 tillers, walk around and pull up 10 tillers, and get a sense for how many green leaves are on the average grass tiller. And so this is how we do it. We start at the oldest leaf. It's hard to tell from this picture, but half of that oldest leaf is brown, but the other half is green. And we're actually going to count that as half a leaf. So we're going to count half leaves. And as we move up that tiller, we've got 3 more full leaves for 3.5 leaves, plus we've got another half leaf that's the newest leaf that's emerging there. So this will be what we call a 4-leaf tiller. And we're going to look for an absolute minimum of 3 leaves when we're deciding whether it's time to turn the sheep out onto the pasture then. And you can see that this correlates nicely not only with the quality, but also how much reserves the plant has accumulated in its roots to survive the next grazing and be able to recover quickly then. So we're going to use a minimum of 3 leaves. And I got a series of pictures here of actual plants to tell us why it's worth counting these leaves rather than just going by height or just days then. So these are 2 orchard grass tillers. The numbers in the middle represent inches of height. And if we were to walk out into this pasture, the tops of those leaves would be flopped over, but it would be 12 to 14 inches tall. Nobody would have any problem deciding that pasture is ready to be grazed then. But we start to get into some exceptions. So these are both 3-leaf tillers. They both would have similar nutrient quality to the sheep or goat. They've both got enough reserves in their roots to survive a grazing, but this is mostly going to affect how much yield we get then, and how many sheep we can feed from a given area then. So this will be a concern more of fertility, compaction. Are you doing the drawing on here, or how's that? Are you seeing drawings on the screen?
I am. I didn't know if that was you or not, Greg. So
It's
everyone
not.
that's doing the drawings, please stop annotating the slides.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So yeah, these are both ready to be grazed. And the one on the right, we could start to address some issues with, again, compaction or fertility, but this is both ready to be grazed. If people are grazing bluegrass, the plants on the left have 2 leaves, are not ready to be grazed. The ones on the right have 3 and are ready to be grazed. If you walked out into each of these 2 paddocks, you'd be hard pressed to tell the difference between them. So counting these leaves would make a big difference in the results we got. This is orchard grass. Many people have noticed when you graze orchard grass, it feels like 2 days later, you can see pretty significant regrowth already. But what's happening in these grasses is these particular grasses were probably grazed down to 6 inches, and within a short period of time, the existing leaves have kind of elongated. So we don't have any new leaves formed. These have all been grazed and are all only at 2.5 leaves each. But it might be tempting to go out and graze this again, because these paddocks would be close to 10 inches tall. So again, you'd be wrong by just going by height. And then the one on the left here, this tiller is nearly a foot tall, but it still only has 2 leaves. So we would be damaging this grass plant also. We may, if we allow these longer rest periods, we may get some yellow and dying leaves underneath, lower in the canopy. And I've found that, especially on a all forage or all pasture ration, these can actually kind of benefit kind of the same way that feeding that supplemental hay will, just helping to create that fiber mat. I don't consider them a problem at all then. Okay, so we've talked about how these longer rest periods benefit the rumen fermentation and the nutrients. But now that we're in this, we're talking small ruminants, this is where we can really make a difference in parasite control. So, what I'm saying for parasite control is going to, we're not going to be working against the nutrition of the animal either then. I think this is the biggest obstacle to doing more grazing with small ruminants is Haemonchus, or the barber pole worm. And the one on the right is a healthy, normal animal. The one on the left is heavily parasitized and becoming anemic. These adult barber pole worms live in the fourth stomach of our sheep and goats and scrape away at the lining of the intestines, causing them to bleed, and they suck up the blood then. So this is a quick life cycle. Many of you already know this, but there's a couple of points in here that we want to keep in mind in this life cycle and how it affects how we graze then. So again, at the top, the adults are laying eggs and living in the fourth stomach of our sheep and goats. Their eggs are shed in the manure. And once the manure hits the ground, those eggs hatch and newly developing larvae emerge from there. And when we get into, the warm seasons and also with lots of moisture, those eggs can become infective larvae in as little as 2 to 3 days then. It doesn't take them very long at all. And so we've got two places to think about when and where we're moving our sheep to. The first is never leave your animals on the same patch of ground for more than 2 days. 1 day would be better grazing, better feed quality, more consistent feed quality for the animals. But after 2 days, not only have we lost a lot of quality in the pasture, but now we're exposing our animals to infective larvae. And then on the left here, those larvae live and crawl up those grass leaves, and they really don't have many other sources. So they've only kind of got so many wiggles in them as they wait. As they wait for the next animal to come eat the blade of grass that they're lying on. So if we can extend that rest period up to 40 to 45 days, that larval population, it doesn't reach zero, but it gets down quite low. We lose about 90% of those infective larvae then. And again, once we get past that flowering seed head stage, we can rest these pastures 40 to 45 days, develop strong, healthy plants and still have the nutrition there. So animals not on a pasture for more than 2 days. 1 day is preferable, and then don't return to that same ground at least for 40 to 45 days.
Greg, we have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Wondering how average temperature might have an impact on larval survival. We're coming through winter. We didn't have 30 below like last year, but what impact does that have on survival?
Yeah, we are going to have some more surviving. Again, it's going to partly, the number that we see this spring will partly depend upon how many there were at the end of last summer too then. So, as we end up with warmer winters and then warmer and wetter summers, we're unless we change our grazing management, they're only going to become more of an issue then. Hopefully
We had another question come in too, Greg.
Yeah.
How many acres of land are needed? This producer has a small flock of about 10 to 15.
Yeah. So, that used to be if you look up old information, they will say, 5 to 6 lamb ewe pairing groups per acre of land. Then if you're going to feed a lot of pasture, a lot of forage, that number, you're going to need more acres to do that. So, even with good yielding ground, if you're trying to get as much as you can off of those pastures, you're probably going to be, more in the, 3 to 4 ewe lamb pairings per acre of ground. But it does depend on what the yield of your land is, and then what you're trying to get from it. Are you feeding lots of grain or trying to minimize grain feeding?
Also the size of the sheep.
And the size of the sheep also, yes. Yep. And I talked about moving animals once a day. For small flocks, they might think that they cannot do that then, but we've got electronet fencing. We could fence in, 500 square feet if that was what was required then. So there really is no excuse for not getting the size of these paddocks right and being able to rest them then. It does take a little bit of work. I have some pictures of some options farther on here, but we really all can use these same techniques regardless of how many sheep or how much land you have. This is a record-keeping system that I use. If you look on the website onpasture.com, which is a great resource for grazing in general, you can get access to this chart. Basically, I'm coloring in each time I've got animals on a given day. We're going to look closer at this. I can make notes on it as well. But the thing I really like about this particular record-keeping system, it's on one piece of paper, and I can count and visualize, did I wait long enough to rest those paddocks, to get our proper parasite control then. So being able to visualize it, I can't remember what I did 10 days ago, and trying to remember if I rested these paddocks, 28 days or 40 days is going to be an impossibility for me. So some sort of visualized record-keeping system is really useful for making this work.
Thanks, Greg. We had 4 questions come in.
Yikes.
All right. So one of them, how do I get rid of the clovers that give sheep pasture bloat?
Yeah, so we don't really want to get rid of the clovers then. We can have too much clover then. Maybe, ideally we'd have, 30 to 50% clover. And there may be times of the year if we've got a lot of clover in a stand early in the spring or in a late fall during a frost where that clover may become a problem. But we're going to try and work with that. One thing that might be going on, clovers tend to like it when pastures are overgrazed. And so if you begin to lengthen out your rest periods, you may find that clover comes back into a better balance then. The grasses will always outcompete the clovers then, if there's no grazing pressure at all. But if we get that more into balance, give those grasses more time to recover, there will be fewer clovers in your pasture, and almost maybe to the other extreme.
Great, thanks. The next question is, what sheep breed would you recommend?
You're gonna make me do that? I'm gonna get into trouble.
No, you don't have to. You can pass if you want.
So what I have pictures later on of mine. The key thing is, there are some breeds that are obviously not as good at grazing and utilizing forage. They've been bred for high grain rations or for show or for different purposes. But if you really want good performance on pasture, select from, it could be many, many different breeds, but make sure you buy stock from a farm or rams from a farm that emphasizes the same thing you're trying to do. You want to match up the genetics to what you're trying to do on your farm. And, unfortunately, just a given breed doesn't always necessarily guarantee that they'll perform. I've got Dorset Ile-de-France crosses, and there's a lot of variation within the Dorset breed. I could, I choose animals that I buy my rams from a farm that selects on all forage, all pasture. So the environment is more important than the breed.
Great, thanks. Next question. how long would you like to have your pasture grow before putting sheep back on?
You need a rest period then. Yeah, I think that that 40 days is kind of a good minimum then. You may early in the spring when it's still pretty cool, the larvae, those parasite larvae are not going to be quite as active, and you might be able to come in a little bit sooner than that. But that 40 to 45 days has worked really well for me then.
Great, thanks.
All right. And with the record keeping, this is my farm. I had them down at my county office. They pulled up my map. I sat down with them for a half hour, told them where to draw these yellow lines. I've got exact numbers on the acres. And this is a really useful thing to have. Again, even if you've just got a small acreage, you could subdivide it how you want to and really be able to make some use of this then. So this is a overgrazed pasture. That's a 1/2-inch PEX tubing. So these plants are not even an inch tall really then, and we just see too much of this kind of grazing in general, but also with sheep. They will keep grazing it right down to the earthworms, as we all know then. And so getting some control over this is really important, not only for the health of the plants, but just the species that end up growing under this kind of pressure are not always what we want. You can see there's bare soil and sunlight reaching down there, and then that's where our thistles come in. Then they need an opportunity to germinate and have sunlight to get growing. Then, and if we deny them that sunlight, we'll get rid of a lot of these biennial thistles and some other foxtails and some other things that we consider weeds, but are really just representing the fact that we're overgrazing our paddocks then. And if we do have an overgrazed situation, or we've gone through a drought, or we've had a difficult time being able to put some more seed into these existing stands really does help a lot. This is a no-till drill, some kind of drill. Again, these are sometimes available through county offices. I think if you call county extension, they will probably point you to some source of a small no-till drill in your area. And again, we're emphasizing keeping perennial stands in place for decades, not years. But there's no reason that we can't use some annual species and drill them into our existing perennial stands to fill in those empty spaces I was showing you. And these are some species that germinate quickly enough and are super high quality to really fill in some of these gaps to help maybe repair some overgrazed paddocks in the first couple of years of recovery and get some really nice production out of them. So look at that bare soil as an opportunity to add some seed. The other thing about all of these species here is that the seed is cheap enough that we don't need a solid stand for it to be of benefit. This is a permanent stand on a grazing farm that does just a super job, but still they wanted to add in some brassicas and some millet there, and it just is that is just super dense. There's not going to be any chance at all for a thistle seedling to get established in that stand. And it's amazing how well the animals perform and just how much forage you can get from that stand. It really is just night and day from that overgrazed pasture as far as how much yield you get. So I just wanted to go through my own farm, kind of what I am doing, and maybe it demonstrates a little bit of what I'm thinking about or have been talking about. So in about 10 days, I'm going to start lambing. And I've taken this forage thing very seriously. I've got good enough quality baleage, that's what I make is baleage, that I can feed these newly lambed ewes, late gestation, first 2 or 3 weeks of lactation on my haylage alone. I'm not feeding any grain to these ewes at all, ever. And I just, it's easier, but I can't say enough about how nice it is to work in a lambing barn where you're not feeding grain separately. The only way you can get the same effect is if you were feeding a TMR. But I walk in the door of the barn, and this is kind of the response I get from them then. Oh, it's that guy again. So I don't get chaos. I don't get trampled lambs or mismothering or other things like that. So this is where I start at here again in about 10 days. And then we're just biding our time, waiting for the grass to grow. The last couple of springs have been quite late, later than I'd like, but we're not going to turn them out onto the pastures until we feel like things are going well enough. And this is early turnout. So I would have some hay also on offer through that first week until the grass really gets up and going. And then once the grasses are really going, we've got a lot of grass. We want to be able to eat it down efficiently. That's one thing about using or allowing these longer rest periods is we're going to just have taller forage. And if we don't control the area that we graze over, we're going to get a lot of wastage then, and we're not going to impact those grass plants, trampling them and allowing new vegetative tillers to come back. So, you know, this is maybe a bit exaggerated that they're all at one end, but again, this is kind of the density that you want to see to be able to harvest this taller forage efficiently. Again, this is kind of the density that I like to see, or the density that gives me the results that I want to see then. And you can figure this out on paper when you're initially working it out, or just trial and error then to be able to harvest this down to about 4 to 6 inches of residual and have those animals be full. And again, I'm doing a once every 24-hour move on this flock.
We have a couple of questions coming, Greg.
Yeah.
The first one is, when you have sorghum Sudan grass in your pasture, to avoid prussic acid poisoning, how long before you regraze?
Right. That is going to be, that's one time when we will go for a minimum height of around 18 inches, 16, 18 inches. The rest periods that I'm talking about in this sheep management, we're never going to be back on sorghum Sudan before it's too early then. Now, if you're grazing a straight stand of sorghum Sudan, then yeah, you definitely want to let it get to that 18 inches before you turn them back in again, or else you could have problems. And then also the other thing to keep in mind in those summer annuals is that if we're in a droughty period, we could run into problems with nitrate toxicity also. But interseeded into an existing stand, it's not going to be an issue.
Great, thanks. And then the other question, just for perspective, how many ewes do you have?
I have, right now, I have 220 ewes on about 145 acres. We also sell a little bit of hay also. So that's our farm.
Great, thank you.
So this is that electronet fence. Most people are familiar with it, but it's very flexible. This shows a paddock that is too long or too narrow for 2 full lengths, and you zigzag it or do whatever you need to do to take up that extra length. But again, we could fence off 500 square feet if that's all we needed for our few animals. Then very easy to use. The longer lengths, they can be harder to handle. It's easy for me to handle this, but I'm a large person. And so there are shorter lengths of electronet fence, 75 feet, that are easier to handle. And then there's this product from Gallagher, the Smart Fence. that is even a little bit easier to handle yet then. It's not a netting, but if it's hot, the sheep respect this quite well then. And I think that's 150-foot length too, isn't it, Gene?
That sounds about right.
Yeah, I think that's right. So what this is 4 reels of a fairly lightweight poly wire, and there are temporary posts that are built in and already threaded onto that handle then. So you just carry that 1 unit through the pasture and push down posts as you're walking across the field.
Greg, they come with 330 feet of
Do they?
poly on them, and we use them back home. We're actually able to add another 100 feet to them, so our smart reels are handling at least 400 feet per roll, and that way we can go the whole way across the paddocks.
Yeah, that'd be nice. That's really long, because the longest net fences I think are 150 feet then. So
165. But
165. Yeah. Okay.
Talking about that netting, how many joules of energy is captured within that netting?
Yeah, you want to have a let's see. Go back.
You're going to want about 3,500 kilovolts.
Yeah, you want at least 25, 3,500, because the problem is lambs. I've lost more lambs than I'd care to admit from them sticking their head through there and then starting to twist it and strangle themselves. So it needs to be hot enough so that they're not even tempted to stick their head through that then. So that is a risk of this electronet. It's a risk that it's not a problem in that Gallagher fencing. I'm quite sure they could bugger it up, but I don't think that they could strangle themselves in it.
Yeah, the joule rating's a whole nother conversation some evening.
Oh yeah, I was talking volts then.
Yeah, so I think the voltage is a better measure of effectiveness of that.
Yeah, and it's what you can measure. It's the meter that's in your pocket when you're out in the field and trying to figure out if it's hot enough then. So yeah, I never want to see it go below 2,500, and 3,000 is better then. So okay. In midsummer, this is the kind of stuff we want to see. I want it to be hard for my dog to walk through this. It's too dense and it's too tall, and he'd just as soon lay down or not come with me onto the new stuff that I'm setting up. So he's a good gauge for me too. These are lambs last year on a perennial stand that had some Italian ryegrass added to it, and that a lot of people would say this is way too tall for sheep to graze then. And again, if you get the sizing right, they'll utilize this really, really well. And I wonder, when people say that this pasture is too tall for sheep, that maybe we've been overgrazing so long that we think that this is what sheep need, but I think it's a chicken and egg thing. I think we created short pastures and then we say that they need them then. So my sheep utilize this very well. They'll harvest, at least 60% of this and leave a nice residual on the ground, conserving moisture and protecting the roots then.
Greg, are your sheep trained that when they get down to 6 inches, they think they're out of grass?
They do get to that point where, they just, they're not gonna work that hard, or, that piece has been stepped on. I'm not going to mess with that anymore then. And that's a nice place to be at. They're used to only eating the best as well then. So, yep.
Right. I mean, ours let me know if they're out of grass. And
yeah. And this is kind of the complete setup. So there's a front and a back fence as I move through these fields. I've got some water pipe spread out over most of my farm, and then there's a salt feeder there as well. So that's what I go out and move every day, and it's quite simple then. It does take time every day, but never more than an hour even on the worst days then. In that picture there too, you can see there's a few thistles. This is a corner of a field, but even out in the middle, there's a few out there then. And so they will emerge, and I've not mowed anything on my farm during the summertime for like the last 3 or 4 years now. And, you know, this is where you start to go off. Maybe you think I'm going off the deep end, but you get these few thistles and you see the flowers on them, and just the diversity of insects on them, it makes it harder to want to mow those off. And so now I see my job in thistle management as keeping my pastures dense enough and healthy enough so that very few thistles can even grow. And the few that do grow, I'm gonna leave there for some pollinators and to give the neighbors something to talk about when they drive by my farm then. So we can get to the point where these thistles do not become a problem and other weeds do not become a problem, again, if we get that density right. This is another picture of my farm. So these are older thistle plants. And just look, I mean, I'm not losing yield. There's a lot of really high quality feed growing right up to the base of these. And I can stand to have a few of them in my pasture then. And I'm beginning, you know, it's sort of the evolution of a grazer. You start with wanting to grow the best feed, and pretty soon you see that you can grow good feed and have some diversity along with it as well. And adding
Greg,
to yeah, go ahead.
Could you comment about stocking density?
It needs to be, there are ways we can figure this out. We can express the amount of grass growing in an area in terms of pounds of dry matter per acre. And there's some cheap tools for doing that. Pasture sticks, if people are familiar with pasture sticks, everybody that's doing grazing should own a pasture stick. And we can say how much feed is actually out there. Then we can say we want to make sure that we leave behind, you know, at least 4 inches, maybe more like 6 inches. And so we're going to subtract that from the total amount of dry matter growing out there. And so now we have a total number of pounds of feed that we actually want to harvest with our animals. And then, you know, we can also know the daily requirements for a lactating ewe, for a growing lamb, and how many pounds of pasture dry matter they need per day. Do the math and come up with that number. It does take a little bit of sketching on the back of an envelope. It's very easy to do, or you can just begin to play with the sizing of your paddocks and knowing that you want your 2 things to happen. You want to leave behind that 4 to 6 inches of residual, and you want your animals to be fully satisfied and full then. And when you reach that point, that's the size that you want to keep going, and that's when you develop the grazer's eye then. So that's the unsatisfying answer to that question, but it's the truth.
All right, thanks, Greg.
Yep. So in terms of diversity also, I am been thinning some woods on my land and also adding trees. And sheep are just an excellent species for being able to establish trees in a silvopasture system. You know, this is all that I require out there. I don't have to fence off whole alleyways and then have to do weed control between the trees. I just do a little bit of protection to keep them mostly from rubbing on it too much. And once we get, you know, to maybe like a 3-inch diameter tree, I can take away these T-posts and the chicken wire. The chicken wire is there for the deer, but also sometimes the lambs will play with the tree tubes. But sheep are just the best species for establishing trees in a pasture. And this is the picture on the right I found on the computer. It just kind of expresses the difference between sheep and goats. Goats are just looking to kill trees then, and the sheep are looking down more. Whereas the ones on the left, those are my sheep, and that's as much harm as they do to my trees then. It's just itch themselves on it and leave a little lanolin on the bark. So if you're looking to establish trees on your land, sheep are a great species. Cattle are just so big that you got to keep them away from rubbing on those trees, or they'll just break them right off then. So sheep are kind of a nice middle ground. And I was in New Zealand a year ago now, touring grazing farms, organic grazing farms, and this is from their newspapers. The population in New Zealand is realizing that just chronic overgrazing in the country is causing these algal blooms, just like we've been getting. They've got their own dead zones, and they're caused by just, like I said, overgrazing, shallow root systems, and excess nitrogen running off into their groundwater. And so bad grazing all over the world is becoming less and less acceptable. I don't know if hopefully most people have had a chance to see this rainfall simulator. But what we're looking at here, this is in the United States now, somewhere in Wisconsin, and we've what this is there's some silver trays there, and someone has gone out and dug a 4-inch deep piece of sod that fits perfectly into that tray, brought it into this demonstration, and then there's an overhead sprinkler that simulates a certain amount of rainfall, and then we look at how much of the water is running off of this ground and how much is percolating into the soil then. And you can see on the right, we've got a cover crop following an annual, and it's doing a pretty good job. But that tall, well-rested pasture, there's nothing coming off. There's no rainwater coming off of that yet. All of the water that has fallen on all of those has soaked into that sod and is being conserved there. And then if we look at the left, we've got a clean tilled field that we would expect lots of runoff from, lots of soil coming from. But look at the one next to it, that overgrazed field that unfortunately represents too many grazed acres around us here. It's nearly as bad as that clean tilled field then. And so, I've gotten to the point where, if a person is not going to put in the time to do a really good job with grazing, the damage we're seeing here to landscapes, to the soils, the suffering that happens in the animals due to heavy parasitism, and just the economic loss from it. I recommend to some people to just leave their animals in the barn and take care of them well in the barn, rather than doing a poor job of grazing. There's just too much harm that's happening then. So I'm going to end there on that cheerful note. Oops.
All right, if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. Greg, what seed mix would you recommend to reestablish pastures?
Yeah, I would look at if there's a way that you can tell what species of grasses are doing best on your farm. So like on my farm, orchard grass does really well. What I would do then is I would plant an orchard grass that is the best quality that I can find then. It's got the most adjustability, the best yield, and I would choose varieties based on that and put together a mix based on that with some clovers, some forbs, what we call some broadleaves like chicory or some others then, and that would be the basis of my seeding. And the other thing to remember about these perennial grass seeds is they're going to be expensive, or at least the more expensive they are, the better quality they are. Because when they start selecting for leaf production, they get less seed produced by these plants, and so because there's less seed produced by the plants, it's going to be more expensive to grow seed then. So be willing to pay more money for good quality pasture grass seed.
Yeah,
Great.
I would chime in that the first thing would be making sure you've got multiple paddocks. If we're not doing controlled grazing, managed grazing, anything you seed will revert to what's already there.
Yeah.
So the old adage, the first thing to plant is a post, holds true.
Yeah. That's right. You'll waste your money on seed by not bothering to do the rest of that, like Gene said.
Next question for you is this producer says they have a hemlock encroaching on their pasture. They've been fighting this for a couple of years. Will letting the pasture rest for a year and get deep help control first year growth?
Yeah, those like cow parsley, I'm assuming is what they mean by it then, or water hemlock. But anyway, yeah, those are biennials. And again, when they are those seedlings are establishing, they need sunlight and they need not little competition then. So the more competition we can give them, the fewer of those you'll have. Now, if it is a wetter growing species, I've noticed this on my own farm over the last several very wet years, that the areas of plants that do better in really wet soils has been expanding. So there's always going to be some changes year to year in the composition. So if we've had really wet years, the grasses are just not going to do well in a waterlogged soil, and it might be that the water hemlock starts to encroach. But if we have some drier years, hopefully the grass will push them back again then too. These pastures the species in them are dynamic, and that's one of the fun things you get into once you've got your perennials established, is that you'll be able to watch species change from year to year and try to figure out why that was.
Mm-hmm.
Great. We had a bunch of questions come in at one time, so I'm just scrolling up through them. So, Gene, if you want to jump in, feel free to as well.
Greg, I was just going to ask, how long do you graze each year, on an average year, and then how long do you feed hay?
Yeah. So lately we've been turning out the second half of April, somewhere from, say the 20th to the 30th of April. And then I pull the weaned lambs off of pasture at the end of October, and those that are big enough to sell are sold then, but it's probably only 10%. And the rest of those lambs go into a shed with a self-feeding, help me out here, Gene, self-feeder with soy hulls and a distiller's grain mix. Then there's no starch in that, so I can transition those lambs from one day to the next. And then my ewes, they stay out on pasture until about the middle of December. And then I begin to feed hay then. So I've gone to more effort in the past with stockpiling grass, and have just had a couple of years when I got a heavy snow or a heavy ice, and I just kind of got skunked. So maybe in a really good year, if I could make it to the end of December, I'd be tickled with that then.
So 4 months of hay feeding, that sounds pretty good.
It's not too bad. No, right. Yep. And then I feed the ewes are fed out on pasture all winter long until shearing day, and then they're closer to home then. So.
All right. So next question for you is on a legume pasture for dairy goats. How do you evaluate that pasture? The producer wants a 6-inch residual, but since they can't count tillers, how would they evaluate this?
Yeah. So if you're grazing primarily alfalfa, then probably the better way to think about it is kind of like somebody would think about making alfalfa hay then. So we're going to need to give that. We're going to want to graze it fairly low, or as low as we can make those goats reasonably reach down, and then we want to not come back to that alfalfa again until at least the late bud, and then even into early flowering. And that would be a good way to rest those plants then.
What if you're not including alfalfa in your pasture mix? On the opposite side, what would you do then?
You mean if it's all red clover then?
If it's mixed brome, and I might have said that incorrectly,
Yep.
and legume, but
Then,
not alfalfa.
yeah. So if we've got a mixed sward where, then I focus in on the grasses then. There's a reason why, all that previous bit of the talk was all about the number of leaves on the tillers of the perennial grass species then. They make up the bulk of it, and their quality is going to affect the overall quality of that pasture more so than the legumes. So if we rest that brome grass so that it's got a minimum of three leaves on its tillers, then the legumes in that pasture will also have been rested long enough then. So we can get away with just paying attention to the perennial grass species in the pastures, and everything else will be fine.
Great, thanks. Can you just touch on briefly co-grazing?
So I'm assuming that means having different species together then. Yeah. It can work then. Again, we just want to pay attention to how much residual we're leaving then. Just because we're co-grazing doesn't mean that we can graze it really, really short. There's still no shortcuts there. Make sure that the animals are used to each other. Sometimes you can't just throw sheep and cattle necessarily together if they've never seen each other before. There's going to be some fear, mostly on the basis of the sheep. Another way to use having different species of grazing animals on your farm is to keep them separate, but alternate when they graze a given paddock. Then we talked about having a minimum of 40 days to allow those larvae to die off, the parasite larvae. Well, if we can put in a grazing by cattle and then come back with sheep again, now we're up to like 60 or 80 days of a rest period. We've allowed even more of those larvae to die off then. So that's another way of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. What would you recommend for winter hay?
Yeah, again, I'm coming at this from a standpoint of not wanting to feed any grain. So I harvest my winter feed from long-standing grass clover stands. I'm not planting alfalfa or anything else special, but I'm harvesting them at a time when I can make the best quality feed then. Really focusing in on cutting early enough to get lower fiber and high fiber digestibility, and that's worked really well for me. I make 3 cuttings a year for baleage and graze off the 4th crop, and that's my approach to it. If you have lower quality hay, you may be forced into a situation where you've got to supplement with some grain to make it work. These ruminants, they can only eat so much fiber in a day, and if it's poor quality, they can possibly starve to death if we're trying to do what I'm talking about with poor quality forage then. So you can't make this work unless you've got good enough quality then.
All right, what time of year are you lambing?
We're going to start here in 10 days. So we're going to lamb from March 28th to April 26th. And hopefully at that point, everybody will be out on pasture if we have a reasonable spring. And that's when I lamb each year. It's kind of I've tried to lamb on pasture, but I get enough fewer lambs born per ewe. And also there's just less time for those lambs to grow off of pasture that seems to work out pretty well for me then.
All right, on the market show sheep side of things, What do you recommend for the amount of grass given without these animals getting bloated?
Being bloated on grass. Yeah, they won't bloat on grass then. Yeah, I mean, maybe early spring on a ryegrass. There is, there is an exception to that, but in general, that's not that doesn't occur then. So grass is about the safest feed we have for our ruminant animals, and it's really it's the grain that's the danger to them.
A producer privately messaged me and said AU Grazer is a non-bloating type that they could try.
I don't know if that'll grow up here.
Yeah, I don't think it will either then.
Okay. Let me see. Next question is, what soil type do you have?
We have silt loams. My expected yields would be around 4 tons of forage per acre. They're not horrible soils, and they're not exceptional soils. So if I can harvest, the equivalent of 4 tons of hay off of an acre, I've had a good year then.
All right. Next question is talking about silvopasture. This producer would like to convert some acreage of woodland to a silvopasture. Are there some shady mixes that you would recommend that are appropriate for grazing sheep?
Yeah, depending on how big this woodlot is, you would be surprised at the seed bank that's still there. And I would focus more on thinning trees and clearing brush, and just let appear what appears then. And you'll be surprised how much bluegrass, orchard grass, some other species are in there without having to do any seeding. But again, if I had to choose, orchard grass is fairly tolerant of some shade, as is bluegrass too. Ryegrass can tolerate some shade too then. So, yep.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. And the last question that I see in here is, let's go back to talking about the AU Grazer, the Auburn University. What about any plants that have condensed tannins to fight parasites?
Yeah, there are these compounds called condensed tannins that do have some anti-parasitic effects then. Chicory, bird's foot trefoil, I don't know, you could pipe in if you think of any others then. And they do, again, have some anti-parasitic activity. They're nice to have, but they're not a deworming treatment then. I remember Ohio State did some on-farm trials with pure stands of them grazing lambs on it, and really saw not much of a decrease in worm load in those animals then. So I would not want to, they're all perfectly fine species for having as part of your pasture, but to count on them deworming your sheep would be miscalculation then. So I just don't think they're going to be up to the chore then. I think it's going to be more important to do the management that I was talking about. And if there's some bird's foot trefoil in there, super duper then.
The trefoil it reduces the population. It doesn't really deworm them.
That's
so
correct.
They're able to sustain a little bit of a parasitic load. Lespedeza is another condensed tannin forage that doesn't really grow here in Wisconsin very well.
Yeah.
So there was a question here earlier, Megan. I don't know, maybe I just missed it. It was who locally might we ask for help? I assume with grazing. It depends where you are. Most everyone on tonight, I think, is from Wisconsin. It looks like we have 109 on. But I did see some Kansas and some other states mentioned here. Check with your local extension office. There's a variety of grazing experience around the state. Your NRCS office, which is going to be at the FSA USDA Service Center. Wisconsin, we have a state grazing association called Grassworks. They've also just recently started a grazing discussion group, so you can post questions to that. You can also find links to local organizations that host pasture walks. I assume we'll be able to host pasture walks by summer if COVID-19 passes. And other resources. If you're out of Wisconsin, I might start with the National Grazing Land Conservation Initiative, and then see if there's a local chapter, and then kind of connect in that way.
And also NRCS, that USDA group, they've got money available if you're newly establishing pasture to help you build fence, put in water systems, and even supply seed then. So if you're new to it, I would definitely contact your county USDA office and see if you might be able to get some both help and money.
Great, thanks. We have time for one more question that came in. What about private pasture renovation? Who in Wisconsin can producers contact?
You mean for the actual physical planting of seed? Is that kind of what? That's what I'm going to assume then.
Yeah, let me get some clarification in too, and I can follow up if it's not that direction.
Yeah.
Just advice mostly. Just advice on pasture renovation.
Okay.
Who can producers contact?
The main thing I think folks should think about is adding clover if they don't have clover. I don't know if the window for frost seeding is closed yet. Looks like we're going to get cold here Friday night, Saturday night, but once the snow is off, we can broadcast clover seed, and the freeze-thaw cycle will work that seed into the ground. If we've got a pasture like Greg has, which is really dense, frost seeding won't work really very well. We need seed soil contact to make that work. In Greg's case, I'd say a no-till drill. If there's a farmer in the area, or some counties have no-till drills. Down the southwest corner here of Wisconsin, Fish and Wildlife has a no-till drill that they rent out very reasonably. Some of the watershed groups have no-till drills that they're renting out. So you just have to ask around and see what's out there.
Yeah. If with a little bit of asking, you should be able to find somebody in your neighborhood to plant it for you, and it shouldn't be too hard of an obstacle. And maybe one other thing, I know it's right at the end, and I didn't mention it. It might be the most controversial thing then, but I do still deworm. So my lambs, they are dewormed once during the summer season at weaning time, which for me is usually the very beginning of August or very late July. And I use a mixture of Sidectin drench, Levosol, and Valbazin all together at once. The ewes are not dewormed at that time. They're dewormed after hard freeze, sometime say in November, and not even so much for Haemonchus. I've got some lungworm issues, and so they're being dewormed for that. So each class of animal gets dewormed once, and that seems to be working well for me. I don't have to do any rescue dewormings, and most of the animals that I am doing have nice pink mucous membranes, but that is what I'm doing for deworming. It's not a zero deworming system quite yet.
Great, thanks, Greg. So since we're at 9 o'clock here, what I'm going to do is stop sharing Greg's screen, and I'll just go back to sharing some of those events that we have planned and the UW Extension has planned. You should now be able to see that on your screen. So just a reminder that because of COVID-19 and UW-Madison's policy, we did have to cancel 2020 Arlington Sheep Day. In response to that, we did add 2 more webinar talks to our series, one in April on direct marketing and one in May on EBVs. So put those down in your calendar and we'll send out more information about that. And then we will launch our last poll here. All right, so you should now be able to see the last poll on your page here. Feel free.
We've got the upcoming event scope. There it is.
There we go. Feel free to drop any ideas into the chat box. If you're not already getting our emails on our listserv, feel free to drop your email on that and we'll send you events on the small ruminant side. And thank you guys for joining tonight. I'm going to stop the recording, but you all can stay on and finish that poll and ask any other follow-up questions if you have them.
Maybe one more thing, Megan, just for the good of the cause. This is Bernie O'Rourke. I'm the Extension Youth Livestock Specialist. And just these types of webinar series is through the Division of Extension through W-Madison, but also the Animal Sciences Department also co-sponsors this event with Extension. So just trying to make sure we have that plug in for the department and the College of Ag. And as our name will look different, I guess, as we move forward with the combined animal and dairy science department. So we enjoy co-sponsoring and working together on these types of events, and looking forward to your information and glad you could all be on tonight.
Thank you, Greg.
Yep, thank you.